Hi, I'm Jennifer Campbell, creator and host of the Systemic Leadership Summit. Welcome to this session, and our topic for today is the application of systemic leadership and systemic approaches. Together, we'll explore how systemic leadership can enter your life from a development practitioner perspective, and how this can shape your experience with supporting the evolvement of living human systems. We'll be discussing and reflecting on what it takes and what it actually looks like for today's guest, and her name is Katherine Long. Katherine is an Ecosystems Development Practitioner, writer, and international speaker. Alongside running her own practice, Evolution OD, she has also held significant roles within the coaching and supervision community, including chair of the Association of Coaching Supervisors and led supervisor and facilitator on the Masters in Coaching program at Warwick University. Ecosystems thinking and stakeholder-based design has always been an important strand to her work, and Katherine focuses on developing practice and thought leadership to support systemic leadership and communities of practice across a range of sectors to achieve environmental and social outcomes at regional and global levels. And today she's here. A very warm welcome to you, Katherine. Thanks so much for being here with us in the Systemic Leadership Summit.
Great, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm really pleased that I can be part of the summit, and really looking forward to our conversation as well.
Me too, and let's just dive right in. Could you share more about your background and what got you doing the work that you do today?
Okay, that could be a long conversation because I've been reflecting on that and thinking about actually, so what are some of those influences and those strands? And very often I think, you know, when we make choices, they can sometimes feel a little bit random, but when you look back you realize actually there was something in the sort of in the mix of the DNA, if you like, that you can start recognizing some of the strands that have actually guided the way that you're working. And I guess for me, some of those key ones are, I think I've always been interested in development, in some shape or form, and largely that was kind of around adult development, and then it looked at cultural development as well in organizations. So that's kind of always been there as a key theme. I think also when I look back at my own upbringing and sort of place of origin, so like yourself, you know, I've grown up and lived all over the place, and I grew up in Japan, and my parents were actually working there as missionaries. And when I kind of evaluate, well, what did I pick up from that? I think you know, they were working in you know, basing themselves in a new place, a new town, working very relationally, getting to know people, getting to know the community, and very much in a kind of organic way, starting to you know, see who wanted to be involved in what they were up to, and kind of attracting people to them. And I think that actually if I translate that into kind of ecosystems thinking or systemic leadership, it's very much modeling that kind of leading beyond authority and allowing what wants, you know, the potentiality of the systems that you're engaging with to emerge. So, and one other strand, I guess, also is I've always had a very geeky side to me, which I think if I'd known that you could study something like ethnobotany when I was at university, I would have just dived straight in, because I've always had a huge interest, particularly in nature, and especially the plant kingdom. And I guess there's just so much that we can learn from that. And bring into our own systems and our own ways of thinking, and sort of some of the logics, I guess, that come from nature originally. So yeah, all of those and more bound together that sort of gotten me to where I am.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for that entry into you as a living human system. Because, and this is so interesting, when I ask people in the summit, when they first started with their systemic approaches or the work that they do, there's also a personal side to it, especially in those years when we shape our views of the world, when we have our first experiences, especially when you're young and you enter these really big different countries or different contexts, or you're unpacking your personality, all these different things make you very impressionable. And when you have all these different experiences and viewpoints and introductions like you did, then that can open up, like you said, different strands and connect with your DNA in terms of what's innate. And this is something that we'd actually like to explore more in the Systemic Leadership Summit. What makes someone enter into a systemic leadership role, and how are their first experiences of their first system in their family also a big influence on how they shape their leadership. So thank you so much for this introduction. And like you said, if there was a particular study that you could do at university, you would have done it. So I'm curious about, where did the systemic approach in your work really become a conscious and deliberate step for you?
Yeah. And that's such a, the conscious and deliberate, I think, is really key, because, as you've already said, the systemic is already inherent. It's in who we are, whether we recognize it or not. We are, as human beings, individuals, we represent highly complex systems just within our bodies, let alone the other systems that we're embedded in and are part of. So I think it's when that becomes explicit to oneself, when you really start thinking in terms of how you are a system, and therefore how almost everything that you touch and encounter is within its own context, and how to engage with that systemically. And I guess for me, one of the really key pivot points to my own development, I can't necessarily draw a neat timeline on that, but I think my own development as a focusing practitioner, focusing is a practice which was developed by someone called Gene Gendlin, who sadly passed away the other year. But he developed, I guess, a practice which was born out of a philosophy of the implicit, the fact that you can't. He talked about the unitary world, this artificial way that we divide the world in terms of units, which works pretty well up to a certain point, but actually doesn't describe reality as it really is, and can sometimes confuse us. We start thinking in terms of the mechanisms we've created and to measure reality as reality rather than what is actually looking at. And so he developed a practice which was really about listening and tuning into one's own lived moment by moment reality, and it's very much body-based, body-focused practice. And I think that more than anything has kind of really grounded me in a sense of my own complexity and how that shifts from moment to moment, and what's held within that complexity that doesn't yet have words and is waiting for me to pay attention to it so that it can express itself somehow. And then that's really been an underpin. I guess that's a very embodied, a very experiential type of practice. And when he was talking about focusing, he didn't mean kind of this intense focus. It was actually what comes into focus when we pay attention in a certain way, and that applies to paying attention to ourselves as much as it does to anything out there, whatever out there means, that we're part of, and how we pay attention and notice in a certain way. And then of course there are all sorts of wonderful frameworks and other practices that perhaps bring a bit more of the kind of cognitive elements into systemic thinking. And I think it was as I sort of encountered those and felt some great sense of relief and familiarity, and oh wow, this has a word or a label or a this or a that, and then of course it's a very enriching journey to be on.
So what I actually hear from you is that with the focusing practice, but also with other approaches where you could actually feel and sense your own system, that was the more conscious way for you to step into the systemic. And what I actually hear you describe is you increase the awareness within your own system. You brought in more consciousness into your system. Oh, this is what that is, or this is how that feels, or this is how this aspect lives within me. And these are my words, but that's what I hear from you. It's like you were seeing into your system. Yeah.
But there's something about that also accompanying the work that you do. So, you know, there's a kind of experiential and cognitive kind of learning that comes alongside, you know, so for me, it was engaging in coach supervision was a really a big eye-opener, because obviously as soon as you are providing a reflective space for another change practitioner, you're almost in that kind of hall of mirrors of multiple systems interacting and holding space for that, so that some form of clarity emerges. And then also working in team coaching and large group interventions. So as I felt more drawn to work with different levels of system, and noticing again how that feels and what it means to sense into what seems to be possible, or what might want to happen for that part of the system. I think, you know, then it's those experiences of working with others that really kind of reinforce and cement a way of seeing things and a way of working.
Right. And you already mentioned different levels within systems and different ways of working, like team coaching and large-scale interventions. So when you started with these initiatives and ways of working, what exactly did you experience as added value? And could you give some examples of the added value that you experienced while working with these approaches?
So I think if I can sort of reinterpret that question a little bit, so there's a value in linear approaches as well, and the systemic. And I think there's something about how do we hold the both in tandem. So my experience has been that the way that systemic thinking can bring and add value is not by diminishing or dismissing kind of what's already there as sort of tried and tested models and frameworks that maybe have, you know, as we kind of look at them, think, well, they're linear, they you know, perhaps depend very heavily on metrics that are isolated views of reality that sort of just snapshots, and, you know, kind of make too much of them and base too much on them in terms of the way that we think about how change needs to happen or how we measure or evaluate change. And yet that is the currency that organizations often are still working with. So for me, it feels as though the added value is to see those approaches as part of the system that you're working with, that also have their place.
So they're part of the bigger system of the range of things that can help move the system forward or help solve problems that are encountered into the systemic realm. But and that they are not, these linear approaches are not necessarily something to be dismissed as, oh, they're not systemic, so they probably won't work.
I think so. And I think then when you help people to think about what is the change context that they're in, I draw on Dave Snowden's Cynefin framework, which, you know, it talks about different change environments, and I think that's a really helpful way for people to recognize where some of the kind of more linear metric approaches are really useful and where they should keep using them, and where actually if they're trying to grapple with complexity or even chaos, that actually they need to adopt different logics. And I think it's when people start seeing that they then realize the value of working with maybe a kind of a wider or a whole systems approach, stakeholder-based kind of design or thinking, working with it much more in a much more emergent way, an organic way, to a set of high-level values or principles, as opposed to, you know, rushing headlong to try and get from A to B, and not paying attention to some of the unintended consequences of that.
Right. So, so actually, you're saying just with this example that you also use a framework where there's different change spaces or ways of looking at the change, where in some of them the linear works, and in some others the linear is less effective. And so, how do you then work with organizations or teams and give them insight in just that? Because, well, most of the time, at least what I encounter when I work with leaders, is that there is such a singular perspective on the change and what's going on and the particular type of solution that fits with that. And it takes some steps, some work to help them switch that perspective. So how do you do that with the different change spaces?
Yeah. I wish I had the magic wand or the magic solution. I guess, I mean, my response would be a pretty pragmatic one, which is that the environment has changed, you know, so the realities that people are facing force that change in thinking, if you can expose people to it. And so, you know, some of the work that I'm doing that is more UK based, for example, there are, you know, big drives to, for example, integrated services, you know, between health and social care, etc., which is mandated and therefore forces people to kind of think differently about how they are going to achieve their outcomes. Or if you have a shared governance model, as they do in, for example, in Greater Manchester, they've been investing quite a lot into. So how do they develop systems leaders who can really see across the whole piece and recognise that they need to work in a lot more kind of a frictionless kind of way to solve kind of place-based challenges. So I think some of that is, you know, if you can leverage what's out there in the environment and really amplify that for people if they can't see it already, and then help them to see what that means in terms of the way that they think about leadership and the way that they think about change. Another example is in the education sector. So again, in the UK, they're moving from kind of a single school model to multi-academy trust. So education leaders are no longer the kind of the top of the pinnacle in their own school system, where they're basically, you know, what they have huge power and influence within that system. How do they then influence and engage across, you know, much wider systems and with many other leaders who may have their own preferred ways of doing things, often sort of that leading beyond authority. And I think it's when people are in that place of transition that they start to really appreciate that something in their leadership style needs to change, something in their thinking needs to change.
So what I hear you say is that one, there's the movements and the developments within for example, a team's or organization's environment that you then tap and amplify and help them see that has implications for their leadership or for the way they shape their change. And that is actually more the natural flow of how change is elicited, and the necessity or the urgency for the change in their leadership is then a parent, and what you then do is amplify that and really go into conversation with them about, okay, if we see this change in our environment, what does it then mean for you in your organization or in your role?
Yeah, and I think it also involves shifting expectations about how quickly change can happen.
Yeah.
You know, if I think of some individuals who I'm working with where they've been able to rely, consistently rely on a form of heroic leadership that has got them recognition, reward, it's really got them all the way, to where they are very senior in the organization sometimes.
Yeah.
And now they're suddenly having to lead on change, which is, across the whole range of different contexts and environments. And suddenly they need to be thinking differently, otherwise they're just going to burn out.
Yeah.
So how do they also perhaps create communities of change practitioners, people who really are bought into and understand the challenge, but who can actually then deliver regionally, or what's going to be appropriate within their own geographies, and sort of actually form that community approach towards change. I think we've put the emphasis so much on leadership development and very little on community development. It seems to be very low ranking, and yet it's how the only way that we can leverage these changes is by helping organizations to develop and grow these networks that are not just about networks for promoting yourself and developing your career, but actually getting the change to happen and to stick.
Yeah. And so this really reminds me of the discussion of do we call things living human systems, or do we call them living human networks? Or because we can never really seem to find the right word. But it's the collective space of relationships, let me put it that way, is that we could tap more, if what I hear from you correctly is it's not so much about the individual, but it's about the leveraging of what we can create and help bring into existence as a community or as a collective. And that is something that holds tremendous changing capability, and that we've not really leveraged that enough.
Yeah. And I think, for myself, as I reflect on, some choices I've had to make about where I work and where I position my work.
Yeah.
I mean, I call myself an ecosystems change practitioner. That sounds pretty pretentious on one level. It's kind of who does she think she is? But actually, I think there's something about saying, actually, no, that is what I'm committed to. For many years, I've been in the coaching sector and very much towed the line in terms of, it's all about what the client wants, etc., blah, blah, blah. And it was probably 6-7 years ago, I really started to get uncomfortable with that. Recognizing that if we are not engaging with the collective, then potentially what we're coaching people to achieve can be at the expense of the wider whole. For me, it became actually an ethical issue as to whether I was prepared to continue to deliver coaching services or coaching programs that were very much in that kind of narrower mindset, or just thinking about it, only focusing on a very narrow way of defining an outcome.
So this also has to do with who or what do I serve? And in different conversations in this summit, we talk about purpose and working on problems that are bigger than ourselves. And what I hear you say is that within the coaching, especially, I can imagine the one-on-one coaching is where we focus on the more individualistic or individual focused type of goals. And but there are bigger planes, bigger context where we could contribute for the well-being of many more people or larger systems than individual people, or narrower contexts.
And I guess that, to me, is a great example of, the expression that gets kind of bandied around. I'm not quite sure exactly who invented it, but sort of the ego to eco shifts, and that is part of it. I don't think that's just a different way of framing things. I think it's actually a stage development kind of shift or transition. So it's actually going beyond. It's not just about thinking in a collective way. It's going beyond the individual. The individual is still important within a much broader understanding of the kind of broader environment that we need to engage with. So it becomes less of an either or and more how do we still pay attention to individual development needs that are legitimate, but really contextualize them in a much, hold that in a much broader field. And that's why, I mean, it's not necessarily unique, but how do we bring more and more of the stakeholders? And the stakeholders are people, things, the environment. How do they become how do we really kind of magnify, amplify their voices in terms of what the changes that we're trying to implement? What would they need? What would they want to say?
And so speaking about including the different stakeholders into the problem or the change at hand, I'm relating that to, I'm just imagining a client coming to you, someone could be a leadership role, or someone in an organization or community or some sort of collective setting, and they ask you, oh, Katherine, we are experiencing problems. We're trying to implement this change and it's not really working. And I don't know where to look next. And all these different notions of the individual and the collective and the linear approaches and the systemic approaches and everything else that we just mentioned is in the space up for discussion. So where do you then start with a client? Because they could be at any level of awareness when it comes to the bigger field of options of where to go next.
Yeah. And I mean, the word you use there, field of options.
Yeah.
I think helping them to see the issue or the challenge that they're holding within the context of some sort of a field. So again, doing mapping exercises, that kind of thing, giving voice to those different parts of the system, helping them to listen with some empathy. I mean, there are a whole range of different approaches to bring to this. So whether it's systemic constellations or theory U, there are a range of things that appreciative inquiry. We can kind of pull on whatever would feel probably, I was about to say least threatening, maybe that's not the right answer there, but something that won't disrupt their system so much that they reject eventually what you're trying to offer, but something that that is relatable to them.
Right. So something that helps them to keep their sort of boundaries open in terms of, okay, I'm stepping into something slightly more unknown, but I can still manage to take the step, as opposed to something that's further away from their frame of reference or their way of thinking.
Because I mean, well, again, you maybe experience this as well. I mean, just how threatening it is for people when they walk into a room for some kind of a team event or something, and there's no tables, you know.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, so I think we just have to kind of, you know, and that's part of the practitioner's own systemic awareness, isn't it? Is to read their system and partner with it, learning to partner with it in a way that isn't then going to just create more resistance.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's what I hear you say, especially with I have a tendency to make a back and forth type of movement. Speaking of embodiment, how we started off this conversation, is that what I hear you do is really bridge between where the client is and the next possible step towards more awareness and more hearing of the voices. And that it's that all that you've collected and all that you've gathered in terms of your experience with different approaches is that you then feel with this movement to see what fits best to client.
Yeah. Yeah, and so there is something about that own use of self, and you know, as somebody who takes advantage of supervision myself, you know, the opportunity to explore what is it I'm sensing here, what am I picking up that is maybe a little bit more at the subconscious, held in the subconscious knowing.
Yeah.
That can then also reveal some kind of a pattern or an aspect of the complexity of the client system that then perhaps, you know, suggests some next steps forward. I think also, I mean, for me, a next step with client, if I backtrack a little bit as well, I think part of what we're doing is creating legitimacy for the client. I think a lot of times when I'm working with leaders in organizations and when I have one-to-one conversations with them, they're very open to thinking in a different way. Whether that might be systemically or spiritually or whatever it might be, that they are far more open to different kinds of experiences. But what is scary is to experience that in a collective where, you know, the shutters come down, you're kind of wondering whether the chief exec will approve or whether this will all feel a bit too weird or whatever it is. So actually normalizing what people actually deep down inside actually probably feel okay with, but just would be very cautious about how other people will, you know, they're kind of overthinking how it will feel for other people. And so I think there is something about creating a sort of a level of bravery. And, you know, that's where sometimes offering different types of experiences well outside of the workplace, you know, immersion in nature type events where people can really connect to themselves in a kind of retreat style environment can also be a really powerful tool to just help people to open up and recognize the world doesn't collapse, you know, just because you get yourself into a slightly different space with other people. And actually they could be bringing some of that back into the corporate environment, and it's okay. And I think part of that is, you know, the more they feel they have stories they can tell about things that have worked well, where they've done things differently. So a lot of it is, as I said, that legitimizing different ways of thinking, different practices that then give them confidence to try things out for themselves, do things differently themselves.
Right. I think this is such an important piece here because the legitimacy is can be so powerful, especially in a change context where, to quote Simon Sinek, where leaders, eat last, but they go first. And so that means that if there's something daunting or scary that actually needs to be done, or actually can create more space for others to also explore the unknown, for example, then especially for leaders to find the legitimacy to try it out in a different environment than a very turbulent corporate space, is then to bring it back into that space and to be an example for others to also step into a place that's much less familiar than where they are today. It's just this example that you can set as a leader to create a safer space, or a space where people are up for something new.
Yeah. And that's really about the inner transformation of the leader. You know, they're going beyond, I think, you know, for some people it starts off with a kind of cognitive, okay, I can see things differently now, and I've got some language and some labels, and it's kind of for some people it's like a fun new set of rules, isn't it? It's a new toy that you've given them, and they're kind of really excited about that. But it hasn't really gone into them yet. And you know, I see that with some practitioners as well, you know, that talking kind of systems or ecosystems, but actually it's just another set of tools. It hasn't really kind of embedded, and it's not embodied in them yet. And I think that's often the leadership journey, is, you know, this idea that you know, as practitioners, we should be on a different journey to the people that we're working with. To me, seems completely artificial and sort of very binary way of thinking. You know, actually, they're one and the same journey, really. And so I think as we get more comfortable and kind of embodied with it, it's also then enabling us to support others to do that. And I think where leaders make a profound difference, it is back to their own what's going on in themselves, how they manage their own state, the level of consciousness that they're coming to particular challenges or situations with, that makes all the difference. So when they start to realize that actually their own inner system and the external system are intimately related, and they can start to take ownership for their own, you know, how they're maintaining and looking after their own system, as being actually the kind of ultimate vehicle for change. And that's, you know, that's not stuff that you introduce people to straight away necessarily, but actually as they start engaging more, it makes more and more sense. And you know, when people start actually having experiences that sort of demonstrate that to them, I think that people can, you know, then you kind of realize actually what's going on in here will be mirrored in what's going on out there. So I better be paying attention to the both. That's that. You know, I think it's more. You know, some people would say kind of more, you know, a spiritual journey. I think all leaders, if they take what they're doing seriously, are engaged in some form of spiritual development. So
wow, there's a couple of things I'd like to reflect back to you, and one of them is what you said about one, what's going on in here is also what's going on out there, and vice versa. So the strong interconnection between a leader in their environment or a team in their environment, to put it in a different systemic level, and even at organizational level and the environment. There's such a strong interaction between yourself and the next systemic level that you find yourself in. So that's one. And then there's also the other, where you said that it feels very artificial to say that as someone who has leaders as clients, for example, or someone who serves organizations or coaches people, that they should be at a different level of development. Whereas actually, being really close to your client, also in sense of that the level of development, will help you then to be where the client is and actually help them make the next step in where they need or want to go, rather than like coaching or co-leading from afar. And usually I relate that to something that is, again, what you referred to earlier about very cognitive, like I need to know in a place where I know it all and I am consulting the client who does not know. And that there is actually a space where you could both not know, or where you could be in the space of the unknown and then move forward. What I really love when I work with leaders and I find myself in a space where I don't know, and the leader also don't know, is that it's like I'm in a place of sense of calm now. I used to way back when become all panicky because I didn't know. And I so much relate to what you said, is that there is the space of not knowing actually has a lot of wisdom in it, that can inform leader or a team or an organization. Oh, so this is a space where we are, where we don't know. So what does that look like then?
Yeah.
Or what does that, how does that inform us then? And these are so thank you for sharing these. These are very profound things in terms of what it actually means to not just systemic approaches, but also to be in the space of change, and how these or other approaches could help, to support living human systems. Yeah. And so what I'm curious about is that sometimes more and more we encounter leaders or clients who have some more systemic awareness than others, who have tried different things, who have tried to implement certain approaches that we would label as systemic. But they're still struggling. They're still finding it very difficult to work with that. How do you then work with them again if they come to you and say, "Oh, Katherine, there's lots of turbulence in our system. We're trying this, and we seem to not get ahead very much." So what do you do then?
Well, that's a really interesting, challenging question. I think one of the things I've been thinking about quite a lot recently is whether we can ever really try and change systems, or whether what we can offer is the enabling conditions for systems to change themselves. And I think sometimes when I'm working with clients, I think they've gotten themselves into the first camp, that they are trying, they see the wider system, they get the complexities of it all, and they feel they have a mission that they have to fulfill by, probably quite a lot of pushing or convincing or whatever it is. That is creating more resistance within the system, and often creates exactly the opposite results that they want to achieve. So if I give the example of thinking about diversity training, that's quite a well-researched case, isn't it? Where actually it often ends up, you get boards that are even more homogenous than they were before. And it's kind of like, well, what just happened there? So, we've invested all this into trying to develop awareness, and it's just seems to be creating the opposite results. And I'm not sure that there are any easy answers to that. But what I think can help is how do we help the system to really see itself?
Mm-hmm.
And that requires being able to create sufficient challenge and sufficient safety to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I think it also invites a place of non-judgment, just allowing people to recognize things just as they are,
Yeah.
without necessarily trying to change. And for me, this comes back to the some of the principles from focusing practice.
Yeah.
Is the more you can just allow your own system, come into presence with what's in your own system and allow that to be fully seen without judgment, without trying to change it, the more likelihood there is, or the more energy it gives that part of the system to move on and find its next way forward. So I think when we're working with aspects of the system that are stuck, the more we try to shift and change it, and etc., etc., can end up creating the opposite result.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what we sometimes need to help our clients do is to kind of look at things a little bit more obliquely, less head on, and that again is counterintuitive. So how's that going to look if in my performance review, that I obliquely looked at some challenge or whatever, but actually how we might find another way of tackling a similar challenge so I guess I'd be helping clients to think, well, you've tried this, you've tried that. Is there a different way that you can create some interventions that hopefully have some real, important real world outcomes, but that sort of brings the problem into the room without necessarily feeling like it's got to be addressed there and then in the room? How do you just sensitize people more to the stuckness so that it can then be liberated and create the conditions for people to be able to do that in?
Yeah.
And I think that is pretty tough.
Mm-hmm. What makes it tough for you then?
I guess I think it's probably tough for the client to take on board sometimes. I think a lot of people recognize that, yes, they can see the logic of that. They can see the wisdom of perhaps taking different approaches. And yet there's always this fear of, but I'm measured on X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
On delivering and being able for somebody else to be able to tick their boxes, I have to deliver in a certain way. And I think that overcoming that very kind of narrow, measurement-oriented way of thinking is one of the key challenges that we keep facing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes I'm not sure that there's an answer to that.
Yeah. So when I reflect this back to you, then what I come up with is that the bigger context that leaders find themselves in, especially those who are already open to systemic approaches, but really there's a mirroring with the outside world. And so it's very difficult for them to really step into that other realm of solving problems, because their superiors or their environment is ticking boxes and want them to perform and to deliver. And on the other hand, they know that if they keep on pushing the way they have been, they'll probably very likely stay stuck. And so it's like a catch-22. And what I take from what you just said is that it's very important for them to find a space where they can be in both worlds, where they can be in the space where there's both the pressure to deliver and there is the space that they create for themselves and for others they lead to step into the unknown, to step into where we don't have all the answers, where we can't deliver just yet, where we cannot satisfy our customers yet, where we cannot make progress because we need to reflect on things and find a space where it's actually quiet, so that new options, opportunities can come to us, or where we can see ourselves better, so that as soon as we put our focus, like you said, in the focus development, or our attention to the thing that we're actually trying to push away, that may lead us to different and more productive answers than before. So it's very much about because you were answering my question to what do you find that difficult or tricky, and that is because it's a very difficult place where leaders can find themselves, and then it's up to you to what can you then do to create more awareness and more openness on one hand, and do that in a space where it's safe for them to do so.
I mean, people are very often caught in that, a real classic double bind. So if I keep doing this, I just make the problem worse. But if I stop doing this, then I don't get rewarded. So, it's like, how do you break people out of that cycle? And I think that requires quite a lot of creative thinking about, well, what else within the system needs to be loosened up to create some space for kind of emergent, dialogic, something different. And actually, there probably are some spaces for that. I don't think many organisations are only narrowly kind of committed to that sort of, easily measurable kind of metric side of things. There are spaces where, people enjoy doing different things. And I think, how do we we can sort of think ourselves into a little bit of a box around some of this stuff ourselves. And I think that's the challenge to practitioners, is to not end up getting caught up in the stuckness yourself.
Yeah.
Because it's easy to find yourself thinking, and colluding with the stuckness.
Yeah. Yeah. So it actually requires then that you recognize where the client is, recognize what the space is that's not yet been explored, and to stay with that opportunity of taking on that space, rather than going into the stuckness where the client also is. And so
I guess so just to differentiate that, because I think there's a difference between kind of ending up with the stuckness and being able to be with the stuckness.
Yeah. So could you articulate that even more? What's the difference for you?
I think getting caught up in the stuckness makes me unhelpful to the client, because I'm exactly in the same space with them. I think being able to be with their stuckness can be hugely liberating, empowering, because I'm able to come alongside them and kind of say, there's this stuckness. Let's just sit here and notice it and see what that stuckness feels like, and what are we seeing or experiencing about this thing that feels stuck, that then provides some keys forward, even they might be small shifts.
So the difference is actually becoming stuck yourself, or witnessing and looking at the stuckness with your client. Wow. And so where I'd like to move next is more about you. You already shared a lot of how you work, what your background is, and what you use from that to do the work that you do. And I'd like to know, where is your growing edge when it comes to the application of systemic leadership or systemic approaches? or in general, helping living human systems with change
Yeah.
and transformation?
Another great question.
Mm.
I think I find my learning edge on a number of different fronts. So a really fundamental one for me is paying attention to my own system, my own ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
And, really basic things like eating and sleeping and, having time to reflect or meditate, really holding myself accountable to where I'm coming from in myself,
Mm-hmm.
um, in relation to particular issues and challenges, and sort of how am I showing up in any aspect of my life, I think is a really critical one for me. And then I think in terms of being bolder and being more explicit about the way I work, I realize that that I'm still in some areas a little bit in transition there. So I think being ready to really stand in this space, and that means that actually I might not end up doing certain types of work or whatever, and being okay with that. And I think one of the things that I felt able to really articulate to myself around enabling social and environmental outcomes, they might be directly, the client might be directly engaged with that or indirectly, but ultimately the work that I do with them has got to have a wider benefit.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a condition that I now put on my work. And I think how I live that out in the way that I practice and hold myself accountable to that,
Mm-hmm.
and the client accountable to that, I think is something of a learning edge for me.
Right. So taking care of your own system.
Yeah.
And I would like to ask you a question from this growing edge.
Yeah.
And that is when you tap into everyone who's watching right now, what is it that from that place that you would like to say to them, or a key learning or a key principle that you'd like to share before we close off?
Yeah. So I think a key message that I'd like all the watchers of our video to be able to take away for themselves is that actually systems leadership or systemic leadership isn't always a mandated position. In fact, it rarely is. It's something that you choose to step into because life calls you in that direction. Sometimes other people call you in that direction as well. Sometimes you get paid for it, but not always. And actually, that it is a role that anybody can choose to take up wherever they are within their own systems. And whilst there's a lot, increasingly a lot being written about systems leadership, systemic leadership, ecosystem, can get caught up with the different labels and things. Actually, this is a field that's really expanding and needs more people to engage with it, and to jump in. Yeah, jump in. That's my message.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you haven't already.
Yeah, I think that's a great key principle and call to everyone who's watching right now to jump into systemic leadership. And Katherine, we have been talking about so many different things, and one of them is how your DNA got expressed into the world in different contexts and different places where you lived, and all the different approaches that you learned and accumulate and use with your clients to help them grow and change as living human systems, and how you work with people who are actually consciously or unconsciously looking for more awareness in how they can fulfill their roles. And you talked about focus development, which is a new term for me, so I'm going to be looking into that more.
Yeah, focusing.
Focusing.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's right.
And so many different aspects, and that you use different approaches, and that meeting the client where they are, and also standing in on the edge of the unknown, as I usually call that, which is not the easiest place to be. And sometimes finding different ways to open up a system or open up a leader in their role system to help them see other possibilities and other ways of working when they find themselves in that catch-22 of, on one hand, having to perform and deliver, and on the other hand, seeing that there's systemic potential and not being able to take that out yet. So that's where you stand next to them and work with them. And thank you so much also for sharing your growing edge and the importance of taking care of your own system. So thank you so much for this conversation. It was a joy to talk to you and to be in this session with you in Systemic Leadership Summit.
Likewise. Thank you very much, Jennifer.
And to everyone who's been watching, I would like to second Catherine's call to jump in when it comes to systemic leadership. There is so much work in the world that we could have a great role in when it comes to bringing systemic perspectives in our living human systems that we are living and work in. So thank you so much for watching to this session. And if you want to take the conversation further, go to our online community space. Thanks again. See you next session. Bye-bye.